Hey, welcome back. I missed you this past week. I hope you're happy and healthy and sheltering in place and ready to continue our World History Honors course to get you ready to be juniors and someday South Point grads, college students, citizens on this planet of ours. I want to remind you of a few things coming up. We were scheduled to have a test last week and we're at almost the end of a unit. So here's our drill for today, and I think what you're going to find is it's pretty much business as usual. I'm going to share stuff with you on here, and I'll share stuff with you via Google Classroom. Let's look at what I've got on deck for today. Make sure you've got notes ready. It might be easy to just replay these videos or think that you're going to, but to be fully engaged, you're going to want to be taking some notes. Don't forget that we're going to have a final exam at some point covering this content, so having your notes ready. One benefit to this style is I'm going to be able to go full speed, and anytime you need to pause or replay, you'll be welcome to do so. You've also got hopefully snacks and you're somewhere comfortable where the air conditioning is perfect for you. Don't forget the slides are also on Google Classroom. So if something seems a little small or you can't see things as well as you'd like to, you're welcome to pull up those slides and review. Want to remind you of something I probably said before we left. This is our private classroom, and I am not a professional filmmaker. And I know when I'm watching like workout videos, I like to make fun of their faces and whatever their mannerisms are. So this is just for us. So I expect this isn't going anywhere else. We're not sharing this, posting this on social media. And then finally, don't forget that you're not totally isolated in this. If something comes up that I can help you with, feel free to email me. We can set up Zoom chats or whatever kind of things I can do to help you. So know that you're not alone in this process. Today, we're going to hopefully finish Unit 9. We're working on a unit called the Enlightenment, Revolutions, and Independence Movements. I know it's been a while. You've had a week off. But these are the topics. We're going to conclude the abolition of slavery, and then we'll also take a look at nationalism and some nationalist movements. And then heading into Tuesday and Wednesday, your job is to review our unit and get yourself ready for our next celebration of knowledge, which is going to be this Wednesday. It'll be a little different, of course. We're not in the classroom, but you're going to be able to go on My Point, and starting at 8 a.m., a window will open where when you go to My Point, you'll click on your class tab and you'll choose, obviously, World History Honors. And sometime after 8 a.m. and before midnight, you'll need to go to that tab and click Assignments. And you'll see the Unit 9 exam. It'll say this, and when you open it, it'll give you instructions. They're exactly like what we do in the classroom. You'll click Begin, and it'll give you the first questions. And rather than filling in bubbles, you'll be clicking in your choice and submitting each question and then moving forward. You've got 50 minutes to take the exam, so just like a typical class period. I know that I can't really restrict who's using notes or what you're using, but it's going to be on a locked browser. You won't be able to just Google things. And it's 50 minutes. So if you're going to try and check notes on every answer, you may only get through 35, and then suddenly you're scrambling to try to submit the thing. It must be submitted before the 50-minute mark is up. Otherwise, it'll shoot me an error that it's incomplete, and we'll end up with point deductions. So feel free to email me if you have questions coming up. I'll remind you tomorrow. Again, this is Wednesday. We're going to be taking that unit exam. All of the materials have been online for the past week. So when we stopped having class together a week ago Friday, we made sure all this stuff was posted. And then this is the topic where we were abruptly cut off, the legal end of slavery. We're including this in our unit as an independence movement of sorts. Labor classes in much of the Americas experiencing independence. And you did a text assignment where you were listing the four arguments presented. So at this point, make sure you're at this point in your notes. Depending on which period you were in, we left off right here, but we were looking for the four arguments presented, why slavery legally comes to an end. And you should have something like these four. Boom. The fear and risk of slave revolts, like what we saw in Haiti. The spread of Enlightenment ideologies, liberalism, representative government. Religious convictions and compassion. We challenge the notion that Christianity ended slavery on its own, but no doubt religious reformers and Religious promoters are utilizing their Christian ideologies to support independence from slavery and the end of slavery. Many abolitionists are also highly religious, highly Christian. And then finally, this was the reason that we left off on economic questions on the viability of slavery. So in the text, this was suggested. Our Enlightenment philosopher of capitalism, Scottish named Adam Smith, examined slavery and complained that it was a monopoly on labor. So think about what that means just for a moment, a monopoly. This is one of the issues that capitalism had to deal with, is what happens if you eliminate competition. And in the case of slavery, there is not competition for labor. So we might think about this, what is it that motivates the slave? They're not motivated for their own benefit, which is a problem for Adam Smith. He argued that we are all self-motivated by our own interests, and therefore the slave is not highly motivated on the plantation. They're motivated to avoid punishment, to avoid potentially being whipped or whatever it might be that their owner invoked as consequences for failing to work. So if this is the motivation, how hard are slaves actually working? And are slaves ever innovating new methods of production or things of that nature? Plus, this is huge. If slaves are not being paid, what can they not do? They can't buy anything. This is completely eliminating a class of people that could be consumers. So for instance, if this is our plantation, and here's our plantation owner, we did this when we looked at feudalism, and we have our slaves. I know this is strange, talking about human beings and drawing X's on the board. But if you were to approach that plantation owner and say, hey, you should pay your slaves, this will be better for economics, that plantation owner is probably going to laugh. No way. What if, though, and I just throw this out, what if you're the restaurant owner that lives in town nearby? How many meals can this one plantation owner possibly go eat from your restaurant? Or would you rather, as that restaurant owner, would you rather have each of these slaves being a paid worker with disposable income that could go to your restaurant? And whether you're a restaurant or a shoemaker or some of the other jobs that we've simulated in our course together, this is an issue for Adam Smith, is all of these people cannot be consumers in this system. And so for the overall productivity of the society, he criticized slavery, that this was not economically perfect. It might have worked great for plantation owners, but for entire systems, this will not be the case. And so government slowly but surely, I back up, are eliminating slavery. Typically, they're eliminating it first inside of their own territories. For instance, look at Britain. In England, slavery officially ends in the territories of England in 1772. But in English colonies, slavery remained until 1833. And this makes sense because it's in the colonies that you have plantation-style agriculture that's growing sugar, tobacco, cotton, etc. The trade of slaves tends to be a tapering off of this process, where the ending of the slave trade will happen first before all colonies. And a lot of this had to do with the example of Haiti. So many slaves being imported that you had demographic imbalances, and a slave revolt was clearly going to happen. So for other places, Haiti encouraged people to end the trade of slaves. It's not that smuggling didn't happen, but legally trading slaves. Many of these places will end that second. Some places like Brazil, which we learned earlier, is importing the most just sheer number of African slaves in this Middle Passage slave trade, something like 3.4 million. Brazil will be one of the late territories to end slavery. Many of these Caribbean colonies will be the last places to continue to utilize African labor and slave labor. But this is where those economies, growing sugar especially, were most prominent. So, huge question. The fallout for this. What will be the consequences, and what will be the future, the destiny for formerly enslaved peoples and their descendants, a big question is, how do you integrate formerly enslaved peoples? Just granting freedom, does that mean they suddenly have wealth? Do they suddenly have education? Do they suddenly have opportunities? This is a challenge. How do you integrate successfully? And assimilate would be a good word. Or, in the United States, unfortunately, the answer will be to segregate, to legally keep races separated. Because slavery had been based largely on race, policies that continued to segregate those races. And in the United States, this is going to be especially challenging. We continue to deal with these challenges. So, if I draw that plantation again, the unfortunate reality is, for many of these slaves, here was our plantation owner's house, for many of these slaves, the one job that they are able to do immediately is agricultural labor. And many of them begin contracting, if we call it contracting, with the landowning elites. And so see if you recognize what this looks like. This is called sharecropping. Where the landowning elite would rent a section of his land to the workers. He might even rent them tools. But they would be granted a section of land and then have to pay, of course, rent. Major portions of whatever they produced would be paid to the sharecropper. So it starts to look like a system we've been looking at all year long. Starts with an F. Are you thinking feudalism? It looks very similar to feudalism. And if you are this tenant farmer, this sharecropper, are you ever likely to save enough wealth to purchase your own plot of land, etc.? Similar challenges. And so the reality in the United States is a continuing, very large gap in achievement and wealth and land ownership between, well, formerly landowning elites and formerly enslaved populations. Their descendants, we continue to live under this shadow. So, next topic. What's going to replace slave labor? Kind of a curious question. You might be horrified to do a little searching on how slavery persists today. And we're not talking in remote locations. It's horrifying how rampant people continue to be worked against their will. And one example I'll share from personal experience, we had visitors from Bangkok, Thailand to one of our classes one year, and they discussed in Southeast Asia how migrants end up captured, placed on fishing vessels, and they never get off the boats. Migrants are attracted with contract labor. They get on the boats, they never get off. And they're worked as slaves. Really disgusting systems, especially targeting people that don't speak the local language, that are coming from somewhere else, desperate for opportunities. So whether it's sex trafficking or other forms of slave labor, still something in existence, but no longer legal. And that's a huge distinction, is we don't have governments sanctioning, protecting overtly the use of slavery. Other options that we're going to see in later units that will replace slave labor. One is indentured labor. Take a moment. Do you remember what this was? This targeted especially Europeans, white Europeans, early in colonial periods, where you signed a contract, you worked for about 7 years, and once your contract was up, you were somewhere new. You might have even earned some saved wages, etc., but new opportunities were expected. The conditions were tough, but what we're going to start seeing is indentured labor will be renewed. So for a lot of these plantation owners, especially in the Americas, they will start seeking labor from East Asia, South Asia, and we're going to see major migrations of people all over the planet accepting these contracts. Another option, next unit, machines, mechanization. Today, if you travel the world, most farming, agriculture is done by machines. And so this will be our next unit. What happens when places like Britain and others start developing machines that outproduce humans in a lot of these labor markets. Finally, outsourcing. One other option. If you can't bring the cheap labor to you, take your production to wherever the labor is cheapest. And this is commonly done today. We'll look at different companies around the world. They will move their production facilities to places in East and Southeast and South Asia, places in Africa. Move your facilities to these places where there are not labor laws, minimum wages, etc. So we'll be exploring these modern replacements in utilizing cheap labor. Okay, I checked the clock. I'm not used to this. I'm in an empty room by myself talking for, looks like 10 minutes done so far. A new topic, and I'm wondering if you can see these numbers well enough. We're going to transition to looking at nationalism. So examine this question with me. This was a survey done by a group. They do world value survey, and it's data on all kinds of things. But an interesting question, surveying people, and I looked at the numbers. Each nation, more than 1,000 people, usually between 1,000 and 2,000 people were surveyed, and they were asked, how proud are you to be from whatever country they were from? And so these were the 4 options you could choose. You could choose very proud, quite proud, not very proud, or not at all proud. And this gives the percentage of respondents and how they felt about being from wherever they were from. So I'm going to give you a moment here, and I want you to analyze the United States' rating. Take a look at Germany. Take a look at the average. And consider, does the date matter? Any other countries of interest? If you want more time, you can always pause. But a couple things to note. If I add up these two numbers, 80% of people, this is overall, and these were select countries that I picked just to have a good spread, but they did this all over the planet, and roughly 80% of people, 80.6, right, feel either very proud or quite proud. So our conclusion is, well, people are pretty proud of where they're from. You probably knew this was coming. For instance, look at the United States. A little math. %90 of people, well, I have to do a lot of decimal places there, but you only have 1.8% of people saying that they're not very proud or worse. 1.8. Most people either very proud or quite proud. Compare that to Germany. Very different results. Why? What might explain that? Having visited Germany, I can tell you this is one of the most fabulous places that you can go. And just being a tourist in Germany, I felt extremely welcome. And this isn't like a happiness survey. This has to do with being proud of your nation. And I think what we're going to see is after a couple of world wars, where being proud of your nation ended up being a huge problem, we can see why maybe a lot of people in Germany are not real comfortable saying that they're very proud of their nation or being from a certain nation. If you change the question about culture, I think most Germans, and can't speak for everyone, but would be very proud of culture. But this is about something we're going to call nationalism, patriotism. And our quote at the bottom suggests people get very, very much wrapped up in pride for their nation. Does the date matter? Absolutely. Did you check out the source and the context here? This is 1995 to 1998. Germany, as we know it, is pretty new in 1995. It's reunified after the fall of the Soviet Union. East and West Germany, we'll see this later in the course, were reunified, but that certainly matters, the timing. For South Africa, timing means everything here. I'll switch to colors. South Africa, hugely patriotic in this period. I mean, very high numbers. And the reason here is South Africa also had been largely reinvented in the late 80s and early 90s. The end of racial segregation, 1994. The election of Nelson Mandela, a black African president of South Africa. South Africa winning the Rugby World Cup. Rugby had people very patriotic. So timing means everything. And you could switch the decade. However, I would say the results in total are going to be similar. People get very excited about where they're from and their nation. So we've been playing with this word throughout this unit. Now it's time to really focus on it, nationalism. And you've got pretty bold, big definitions there. But process this and then put it into your own words as best you can. We're talking about political boundaries, nations, and the expectation that this should be based on the identity of people. A France for French people. A Britain for British people. An America for Americans, etc. The idea that the nation is the most important power structure. If you think about it and you're traveling abroad, which many of us are not doing at the moment, but when you're traveling abroad and people ask you where you're from, you tend to say your nation. You probably don't say, I'm from Pima County, or even necessarily Arizona. You probably say that you're American, you're from the United States. And likewise, they would respond with their nation, because that says a lot about who you are, the language you likely speak, the food you might eat, your identities. And of course, the sense that your nation, your people, if you put it this way, and your identity might be superior. So the way this functions in society, a lot of different ways. And we might say the double-edged sword of nationalism, the two faces of nationalism. Certainly this does a lot of beautiful, unifying things. When you think about how you were raised and from day one, you've been surrounded by nationalism. When you think about a day at South Point, even before we say the prayer to God, we do the Pledge of Allegiance. We stand and we put a hand on our heart and we look at the flag and we recite a pledge of allegiance to a country, to a nation. Think about holidays like the 4th of July and the way that this creates communities and unity. Think about politics, and this is oftentimes the selling point, that the nation's the most important identity, and it should be a high priority on everyone's minds. You might need to sacrifice for the nation, even die for the nation. On the flip side, though, anytime you create an us, even unintentionally, you might be creating a them. So the sense that your country is only for you, or for your identity, that where you're born determines your fate. And in earlier periods, we criticized feudalism for the idea that you're born a lord, you're born a peasant. Or we criticize that you're born slave, you're born free. But it's typical in today's world to say you're born in this nation and that grants you these rights and you're granted these benefits. You are not born in this nation and therefore this is not yours. So something to consider. How high of a priority should the nation be? And when we start looking at the world wars, extreme nationalism became a major problem, where the nation was placed above religion, the nation was placed above family, or above just human values. So this is something to consider. And again, the two faces of it. The Olympic Games, which we're hoping go down in Tokyo this summer, but people get very excited about the Olympic Games, rooting for their country and their identity. But sometimes the Olympic Games is used to make political statements. We've seen attacks and assassinations in the past to make statements over whose nation for whom. So, first two examples of nationalism. It's weird to think that Italy and Germany are both relatively new nations. They're both younger than the United States. But both of them come into existence in the 1800s because of nationalist movements. We've used the term Italy and Germany before, but we were talking about people. We were talking about culture. And yet, it's not until the 1860s and 70s that both of these places become unified nations and develop flags, right, and national anthems and national identities. So, I'm going to clean this up for you a little bit, and we're not going to need as many details that are up here. But in general, we're going to look at these two stories as highly similar, where a common culture, common language becomes a nation. So let's do Italy first. And maybe you could do side by side if you want to organize it that way, or Italy and then Germany. But let's shoot for the unification of Italy and Germany, and then we'll shut it down for today. So Italy, a common language, Italian. And a common culture, things like Italian opera, or in this time period there were Italian language newspapers and magazines, periodicals that people were reading. A shared culture existed on this peninsula. But when you look at the geography, this is Italy in 1858. It had several different principates and states. You had Rome and the Vatican and its holdings, but this was not a unified region. And so in the 1850s, this is after the Napoleonic Wars, where France for French galvanizes Britain for British, and you have these countries swelling with nationalism. Italy and some of its key leaders, some of these Italian states, sought to create a nation, a common nation for Italians that could compete. And so we don't need to know the name of the politician, but here he is, Camillo di Cavour. He was the prime minister of this green territory here, Piedmont. And Piedmont sees some fortuitous timing because Piedmont's two big neighbors to the north, you have France up here, and you have Austria-Hungary over here. These two countries were at war, and Piedmont decided to jump in support of France. And the hope was for Piedmont to be there at the end after victory to gain concessions from Austria-Hungary, which is what happened. So France defeats Austria-Hungary, and Piedmont is there at the peace wheeling and dealing and gains these territories, the northern part of the peninsula. So a domino effect begins, led by pushes from Camillo di Cavour and Piedmont, another revolutionary movement and unifying movement from the south, Giuseppe Garibaldi, and suddenly we have a combination of Italian states, Italian speakers, and Italy for Italians. So the date on this is 1870, and this is all we need. Nationalism in Italy will form a common nation, and Italy for Italians. Germany, similar ingredients, similar story. Nationalism resulting from a common language, Germanic, and a common culture, Kultur in German. So in the 1800s, you have almost a renaissance of sorts in Germany. You have a flowering of culture and music. Wagner and Beethoven with opera, and philosophers like Nietzsche, Herder, Hegel. It's having its own enlightenment, a German enlightenment. And this sense of pride and the desire for a common nation for Germans will come to fruition. This is also a response to the Napoleonic Wars. You might remember that Prussia, here's Prussia, was one of the key opponents to Napoleon. And so as a response to the Napoleonic era, Prussia is going to be the key mover in pushing for a Germany for Germans. So there's already some unity here. If you remember historically, what was this region called throughout much of the Middle Ages? You had a bunch of Germanic states, and remember they had princes who selected an emperor, a Holy Roman Emperor. This was the Holy Roman Empire. So reminding you about the Holy Roman Empire. Also, these states participated in a trade union that you don't need to know called the Zollverein. But the politician that we do need is named Otto von Bismarck. Here's his picture up here. We're getting into the period of photography. And it will be Otto von Bismarck, kind of like Camillo di Cavour of Italy, that will be pushing for a Germany for Germans. So, the same war. Remember we had a war between Austria-Hungary and France. Put it onto this map now. Austria-Hungary, France, they're at war. Prussia will also help France defeat Austria. And so in winning against Austria-Hungary, Prussia is going to gain territories. And we can see the same process, but here's the tricky part, is shortly after this war between France and Austria, Prussia will declare war and start a war with France. And this is going to set the stage for really poor relations between France and Prussia. This is sounding like World War I already, but after defeating France, Prussia will unify this region into a Germany. And so, the Prime Minister, who's oftentimes celebrated for or criticized, depending on your point of view, orchestrating all this action and unifying Germany, it is Otto von Bismarck. So on your exam, you're going to see a snippet of his speech that focused on blood and iron, the unity of German peoples, the unity of a Germany based on blood and iron. The blood recognized that this would be potentially violent, this would take sacrifice, and then iron, leading to our next unit, the idea of industrialization and pushing for the development of machines and factory systems and railroads. This would be next unit, but this is the goal for Otto von Bismarck, to unify Germany with blood and iron. And the dream comes true for Otto. 1871 is the date. So we have Italy, 1870, flag, anthems, a competitor. And we have Germany, 1871, flags, anthems, common culture. And especially in Germany's case, this is going to be a very competitive situation with France and Britain. Germany is going to become very powerful very fast. We are looking at World War I and II on the horizon. So, one last term. Both of these politicians are remembered for realpolitik. I know you're not in here with me, but try this. Say realpolitik. You could even scream. And I don't know where you're watching this, but realpolitik. This is the term for doing what needs to be done to accomplish your goals politically. Realpolitik, like real politics. Many of us recognize politics. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty, or there's kind of the expectation you got to wheel and deal to get your objectives completed. And especially in Otto von Bismarck's case, the two wars, playing two rivals, France and Austria, against one another, exemplified realpolitik. He may not have made the most ethical choices, but the sense was this is what you needed to do to get the job done. So we've seen this before. Kind of the end justifies the means in politics. Who was the Italian Renaissance author that popularized this idea, the end justifies the means? Do you remember? The Prince? Realpolitik is a good example of politics where the end result justifies the means. So, let's stop here. I've been talking by myself in a room for like a half hour straight. A good place to stop. Tomorrow, Tuesday, we're going to look at more nationalist movements. This idea of a common nation for a common culture all over the planet. We'll look at nationalist movements, and we'll also do a little review, but you have your review processes to do on your own to get ready for Wednesday. Wednesday is our unit exam covering the Enlightenment, revolutions, and independence movements. So if there's anything I can do for you, don't be shy, email, let me know how I can help you in this process. But you've got the review guide online, you've got crash course videos, you've got our Google Classroom resources, and you already know what to do. You've been through this process. So until tomorrow, see you then.